As a disciple of Jesus Christ, we now know that we want to grow to the full stature of Christ, giving expression in the areas of knowing God. This is where God works within us and transforms our own lives. Then loving people, where we become an instrument to serve and bless and engage with those around us. But then there's also this aligning with the purposes of God, the mission of Christ on the planet. And here is where we talk about impacting our world. We recognize the importance. To impact our world, we need to have a theological framework, an understanding that when we engage our reality, engaging society and culture, and trusting God for transformation in our communities, in our cities, we're not just trying to be nice as Christians, but this is part of what Christ came to lay his life down for. You see, the worldview that we're leading people to understand as disciples of Jesus Christ is that Jesus Christ is Lord of all. Christianity, in essence, is a comprehensive framework that touches every dimension of our lives. It is a worldview. There's a saying in Africa that it takes a village to raise a child. And what that means is that your context, your village, there where you grow up and where you live and where you function, has a distinct influence on how you interpret your reality, how you interpret the world. Your worldview, your beliefs, your values, your convictions, everything is formed within the context of your village. It's fascinating for me as I travel the world. I've been spending some time in the USA, and I'm fascinated how in certain areas they look at things totally different to where I come from. They play their football with helmets on. And then they ride their motorcycles without them. And they think that's the way it should be. And I know it's wrong. Why? Because I think different. They think different. You see, it's more than just helmets and motorcycles, football. We know that your environment has a distinct influence on defining how reality is interpreted for every human being. So if it's true that it takes a village to raise a child, the question bodes, who raises the village? Now, my suggestion is that if the church does not show up to be part of that conversation, we cannot be angry and irritated when secular humanistic values are imposed on our society. You see, we are not just called, we are mandated to be part of that conversation. Now, it all stems from the knowledge that Jesus Christ is Lord of all reality. When we read in John chapter 1, we see how John tries to define the engagement of Christ within our world. And he starts off by referencing that in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. Now listen to this. All things were made through him, and without him nothing was made that was made. You see, everything exists and came into existence through his command, and therefore is subject to him, and by implication needs to find its purpose and its functioning in alignment to Christ. The implication of this is that every sphere of society, every context of society, whether it's government or media or arts or education, really only finds their true expression in alignment to Jesus Christ. So whether we study ecology or ethics or economics, all of that needs to be interpreted from the lens of the departure point of Jesus Christ. Now, John carries on and he communicates in John 1 verse 10 and 11, he was in the world. So Christ, the author, the one that created all things, came to the world, and the world was made through him, and the world did not know him. He came to his own, and his own did not receive him. It's interesting. Jesus engages in this reality. He's the author of this cosmos, and somehow the world rejects him. In John 1 verse 4 and 5, he says, in him was life, and this life was the light of men, and the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not comprehend it. But you see, that is part of our understanding of our responsibility within the context of a very broken society and culture. We have to understand that when John writes about Jesus, he says in the beginning was the Word, and the Greek word for the word is logos, which literally means the idea, the word, the rational pattern of creation, the order of the universe. Charles Colson writes and makes this statement, and he says the church's single failure in times past is that we did not see Christianity as an all-encompassing life system, that Christ had something to say about every sphere of society, a worldview that governs all areas of existence. And then he goes on to say, by failing to see Christian truth in every aspect of life, we miss the depth and beauty of meaning. And he'd say the thrill of seeing God's splendor in the intricacies of nature, hearing his voice in the performance of a great symphony, detecting his character in the harmony of a well-ordered community. In other words, discovering the influence of the Logos, the origin, the pattern within every expression of life. Later, Paul would even write about Jesus and say he is the firstborn of all creation. And that term, firstborn, once again in the Greek, is the word proto. And proto denotes not just first in terms of numerical order, but first in terms of specification. It's where we get the concept prototype. So Christ is the proto. He is the specification of all reality. And once reality aligns itself in the discovery of Christ's influence, it aligns itself to give expression as God intended it to be. We have to see Christianity then as this comprehensive framework of truth, so that could enable us to engage redemptively in our society. You see, if we do not see that Christ has something to say about every area of society, we withdraw and we position ourselves against, and then we judge and condemn and speak a negative reference to what we see, instead of engaging it in the belief that we can redeem it, that we can bring it to its true design. And so if you do not have this framework of understanding, there is no motivation to want to redeem and restore and engage the brokenness of society. When Jesus pays the price on the cross, he pays the full price for both personal salvation and cosmic reconciliation. Now, we know, and in Christian circles, we are totally convinced of the personal salvation. And so if I had to draw an axis and say, man fell, Jesus died, we believe there is personal salvation. The reality is, when man fell on the other axis, there is creation that now experienced the curse and was subject to an inferior reference, but then Jesus died. And now many times we only see the vertical axis, but not the horizontal axis. But in the horizontal axis, we see how the Bible is very clear that Jesus Christ paid the price to redeem all things. Listen to what Colossians 1:15 to 17 would say, and then also verse 20. He says, who is the image of the invisible God, speaking of Jesus, the firstborn of every creature, for by him all things were created that are in heaven, that are in earth, visible and invisible, whether they be thrones or dominions or principalities or powers, all things were created by him. And then he says, and by him to reconcile all things to himself. Hear the all things concept. By him, whether things on earth or things in heaven, having made peace through the blood of his cross. To reconcile all things to himself. Unfortunately, so many Christians function from a biblical worldview where Christ, being Lord of all things, all spheres of society, and every dimension of society, does not really exist. And many of them only have a cursory knowledge of the Bible, and for the most part, many times just picked verses that somehow reinforce me being blessed, me being encouraged, and perhaps, having eternal security. But if we read the biblical narrative, then we see in the bigger picture of redemption, God engaged through Christ to restore all things to himself. But because of our limited understanding of this broad biblical narrative, we see how we have a fragmented understanding, and so a limited influence, and many believers, many Christians, then enter into a secular humanistic world governed by that worldview and acquiesce to all things around them pertaining to the stewardship of this world, to secular, humanistic ways of thinking. And we consequently have many Christians in places of influence, but our problem is we don't have Christian thinking in those places of influence. And so we see abundance of Christians in government, in schools, in universities, hospitals, politics, business, spheres of society, artists, sports, individuals, but we hardly ever see how they influence those environments with Christ-centered thinking. We're calling for an incarnation of the Christ life into every sphere of society. This is what Jesus prayed. Remember John 17, pray not that you take them out of this world, pray that you send them into the world as you have sent me into this world. The question is, how can we more effectively function from a Christ-centered worldview and influence society? Well, if we look at history, we see God's people having gone through an experience where the Babylonians have come, conquered Jerusalem, and taken the exiles all the way to Babylon. And then there is a bunch of young men that are Jews that grow up in Babylon. And it's the story of Daniel and his friends. And if we look at Daniel, we see how this individual engages a Babylonian culture and does not acquiesce to the culture, but influences it with all wisdom and understanding. And there are a few principles that I see in Daniel's life that I believe are very helpful when we talk about Christians engaging with a Christ-centered worldview into our Babylon, our world. Well, the first one is, it was very clear that these young men were well equipped to serve their society. You see, society will open up to us if we qualify ourselves to bless and engage in a professional way. Now, Daniel 1 verse 4, it speaks about these young men, and it says, young men in whom there was no blemish, they were good looking, gifted in all wisdom, possessing knowledge, and quick to understand, who had the ability to serve in the king's palace. Notice their qualifications. Well, good appearance, of course, helps. But really they were showing intelligence in every branch of wisdom. They possessed knowledge and understanding, and they had the ability to serve within the framework of the king's engagement. You see, many times we think that Christians need to engage society with 3 scriptures and some condemnation why they are wrong. But it's amazing when you read Daniel, Daniel never spoke against the king, he never spoke against the system, but he engaged that system and fundamentally affected it. But they qualified themselves. The second very interesting concept that I read with these young men is they could speak the language of Babylon. Once again, Daniel 1 verse 4, the rest of that verse says, who had the ability to serve in the king's palace, and then it says, and whom they might teach the language and the literature of the Chaldeans. Isn't that interesting? They became experts in the language of Babylon. You see, many times we are so taken up with our Christianese that we don't speak the language, that we don't understand how to engage society. And so we've got to understand that as Daniel, they became people who were sensitive to the contemporary reference and engaged it. But the third principle I see is They immersed themselves in the culture, but did not compromise. You see, you don't have to compromise your convictions when you engage with society. Listen to the following verses, verse 5, 8, 11, 15, and 16 here in Daniel 1. It says, the king appointed them for daily provision of the king's delicacies and of the wine which he drank, and 3 years of training for them, so that at the end of that time they may serve before the king. The king goes and says, I want them to be trained in these areas. I want them to eat and drink the following. Verse 8, but Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the portion of the king's delicacies, nor with the wine that he drank. Therefore he requested the chief of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. And verse 11 says, please test your servants for 10 days and let them give us vegetables to eat and water to drink. And then it says, and at the end of the 10 days, their features appeared better and fatter in flesh than all the young men who ate of the portion of the king's delicacies. Thus the steward took away their portion of delicacies and wine that they were to drink and gave them vegetables. Here's very interesting. Daniel engages with grace to challenge what the king had told him to do. He never compromised his own convictions. He even allowed them to change his name. It says in verse 7, Daniel became Belshazzar, Hanani became Shadrach, Mishael, Menach, and Abednego. They changed their names. They were willing to adopt another reference, but never compromised their internal convictions. The fact is, they behaved in such a way that they won the favor of Babylon. Daniel 1:9, now God had brought Daniel into the favor and the goodwill of the chief of the eunuchs. We live from a sense of calling and destiny, and we can trust God that even Babylon will desire to have what we have, because in us is life. And this life is that which changes our world. They, however, seized every opportunity to engage. It's amazing, if we read this, we see how Daniel says, please test your servants for 10 days. And then he says, and let our appearance be evaluated. And as you see fit then, after you've done that, deal with us. I want you to hear these concepts. They did not engage with arrogance. They did not engage in a way where they tried to challenge the system. Tone and posture is key in this time as we engage our own Babylonian system. Please test. Let us be examined. They said, look at us. You can evaluate our lives and then make your decision. You see, many times Christians want to communicate truth but not allow themselves to be examined. This is our challenge. We have an incredible opportunity in the time that we live in to be able to bring a worldview that Christ is Lord of all reality to every space within our world. But let's do it with wisdom. Let's do it with grace. Let's do it with a posture and a tone that invites people to want to engage with us. May God give us grace to see Christ as Lord of all and also Lord of where you are every day of your life. God bless you.